Hello and welcome to the Sandip Roy Show on Express Audio.
The Sandip Roy Show.
Chances are most Indians would struggle to pinpoint Bhutan on the map, or for that matter, all of the seven sisters of India's northeast. Many of us grew up with a spotty knowledge of the many rich cultures of the Northeast. I, for one, only knew of Bhutan as a mysterious mountain kingdom of Buddhist monasteries and the Takin, which seemed a cross between a cow and a goat, a place from where we got druk orange squash and pineapple rings. It's in fact almost always a story about tourism, either Bhutan's efforts to regulate tourism by slapping steep fees, or tourists flooding in to see an unspoiled corner of the Himalayas. But what was it like to actually grow up in Bhutan in the 50s and 60s? This week, we start an occasional series focusing on stories and the culture coming out of India's northeast. And we begin with India's neighbor, the Himalayan kingdom of Bhutan. Kunzang Choden grew up in a landed household in Bhutan and tells a complex story of a country caught in the winds of change, both feudal but also desperately trying to modernize quickly as well. She joins us from Bhutan to talk about her memoir, Telling Me My Stories, Fragments of a Himalayan Childhood. Kunzang Choden, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
For most of us growing up in India, Bhutan was this mysterious country. We only knew of, druk marmalade and druk orange squash actually. But for you, growing up in Bhutan, before you came to India, to Kalimpong to study, what were your ideas about India?
India was a big mystery for us also, especially in the 1960s, because travel was limited. We were just living surrounded by the mountains, had never been beyond, and we had heard of India. Of course, we knew Buddha came from India. Occasionally in my childhood years, I knew that some of the candy, we had no sweets in our diet. Candy came from India. And, we just knew that it was a big, huge country somewhere from Bhutan. And only when it happened that I was to be sent to school in India, then suddenly I got very actively curious. And where is this India? How do the people look? And we had all sort of kind of beliefs and myths about India. And I described when I first say that when we sent to India, I was so desperate because I had no image of an Indian, that I was looking around for cues on what Indians looked like, how they behaved.
You thought they would have yellow eyes?
Yes, because that was the myth. We were told that because they ate so much mustard oil that their eyes had turned yellow. So I was always looking for yellow-eyed people.
So how did the reality live up to it when you first come to India with all these myths?
With these images in my mind, when I first met the Indian who was the truck driver, I was always slyly looking at his eyes to see if it was yellow, and it was just like mine. It was not yellow, no. Of course, and then I come from a place which is just a valley, just surrounded by mountains. So the expanse of the plains once we got into India, and we didn't see anything in the horizon except the sky meeting the ground. And suddenly, how could this be a country without mountains? That was a huge thing. Where does it go? We knew around us, the mountains. There was another village behind. There was one on the other side. The expanse, the openness was just quite frightening.
Right. And going to school in Kalimpong from Bhutan does not sound like a huge deal now. But tell us, in those days, what was that journey like?
It's not a big deal anymore because within hours we can be there. But in those days, very few people traveled to India. And that was really people who went on pilgrimage, and they planned it for years, and, they had to put together everything. And There was no roads, there was no communication. So the people who traveled with us, who was our group leader and a translator, I mean, he just knew we traveled from here to here, we stopped here, and so on and so forth until we reached the end of the Bhutanese mountains and then go into the Indian plains. And beyond that, we didn't know anything. We knew there were no restaurants. We knew there were no places that you could eat from. So we had to pack and prepare. So it was a huge preparation. And even though I was very young, I knew my parents were preparing for days. This is for 7 people for so many days, that much salt, that much butter. So everything had to be planned. And once you started the journey, there was no way of contacting the people you left behind, no way of contacting people you're going to meet. So it was really a journey into the unknown. And every day dictated by the weather, we didn't know whether we'd be sleeping in a cave or whether it was good enough weather to sleep under the trees and just sleeping with a baggage made into a semicircle and our horses grazing around. It was very different to what today, foreigners and tourists come pay huge sums of money to have that kind of life which we felt we had to endure. So how things have changed is amazing. And when I meet people and they say, we are trekking in Bhutan, and they have 20 horses and gas cylinders and chairs and tents just for fun. And I said, that was no fun for me those days.
And what I didn't realize in my utter ignorance was that I thought all people in Bhutan spoke the language of Bhutan. But you spoke a language that even other Bhutanese kids in your school in India didn't understand. And you didn't speak English, really. You must have been utterly miserable.
Yeah, it was a very difficult time. Bhutan being a very, as you said, in those days, mysterious, hidden away. Nobody knew where the country was, what the people like. But even for a small size, the area of the country is small, the population is small. But because of the way the terrain is, each community is separated from the other. So we have as many as 19 different languages.
Wow.
Yeah. And I spoke what is the language of central Bhutan, Bumtang Kha, which was confined to Bumtang area and a little bit into the south, not comprehensible to the west or the east. And most of the Bhutanese children who were already in schools were mostly from the West, who had kind of a superiority complex, saying we are from the capital, we are the ones who speak the court language. And, somebody who didn't speak that language and spoke another language, they thought must be quite a peasant, quite ignorant, and not sophisticated at all. And not speaking either the Nepali language, which was the language of Kalimpong, English, which was the language of the school, and not speaking even the language which my Bhutanese children who had been there speak. So I was really without any kind of communication. I was completely cut off and all by myself.
How did you survive?
Well, I think children are very resilient. You just move on from one step at a time. Not being able to talk, not being able to understand anything. I think I tell the story of how I spoke to myself in my language, telling me stories that I'd heard before in my home. I just felt I had a home, I had a language, I had a family, and what was happening in the school was something that wouldn't last or things would change. I think I couldn't verbalize all that, but I think that's how I survived. And finally, it was one of the very kind maids or ayahs, Nepali woman, who spoke to me all the time. Although, she knew that I couldn't speak, but she spoke to me all the time. And that was really the turning point that I could talk to somebody. And of course, everything was different because we hadn't been prepared that beside the Indians, the nuns, they were all Irish nuns.
Right.
And they didn't not only had yellow eyes, but they were all blue-eyed and they had their, habits and they were covered. So it was really, we were just being thrust into another world that you could not have imagined.
And in fact, I should mention here that the title of your memoir, Telling Me My Stories, is in fact what you were just referring to yourself as a little girl lying in bed, telling yourself the stories in the language.
Exactly. Yeah.
How unusual was this that you, as such a young girl, was being sent to an entirely different country to study by your parents?
Yeah, it wasn't quite unusual, but it was something that was, I think I mentioned that Bhutan until the 60s was an oral society. So the only people who could read and write were the monks and some of the elite. And if you wanted to read and write, you had to employ a tutor or join a monastery. And suddenly when Bhutan wanted to modernize, they said education is the main building blocks, and we have to have an education that will link us to the rest of the world. And we didn't have that system. So there were no schools, modern Western kind of schools. And planners and the implementers said, we have to send our children to be educated outside where there are schools. And in the meantime, also built new schools that were not monastic schools. So this was happening all over. And I think Western Bhutan, because of its closeness to the Kalimpong Darjeeling, they were the ones that went first. So there were already students who had gone ahead of me. And in Pumtang, which is central Bhutan, they were encouraging the parents to send their children to schools. But the parents didn't understand it. They thought it was being like send children into exile, and they were afraid of what the children will be exposed to. And many of the parents had no imagination of where India was. And my parents, when they had this option, they agreed to send 2 of their children to school. In fact, the education department was asking for 2 sons. But then my father and mother, for some I never found out, but they decided to send my older brother and myself, and not my younger brother, who was just a year younger than me. And of course, now I began to think that perhaps they thought they couldn't lose 2 sons at a time, but a woman and girl can go. Yeah.
But you were actually raised as a boy. Tell us that story.
Yes. For some time, I was raised as a boy. And this happened, already the background was there that in my ancestral home, my father's home, there were very few girls who survived. In fact, I traced back about 18, 19 generations, and there's no mention of girls. It's all been boys. And there were 1 or 2 women who'd sort of just fade into the background. And I think there was a belief that no girl would survive in this household. So this was in the back of my parents' mind. Everybody in the village thought I wouldn't survive. And then just as they expected, I had this health problem or psychological problem, or I don't know what it was, but I could go into a faint at every moment. And this caused my parents a lot of anxiety. And finally, they asked traveling monk. In those days, there used to be monks going back and forth. A traveling monk from Tibet came, and my parents beseeched him and begged him and said, please do something with our child. And he said, no problem. She was never meant to be a girl. Convert her and let her become a boy. So I was, until then, a girl, converted, dressed in boys' clothes, treated like the boys. And coincidentally, I don't know if it happened because of the spiritual changeover or because there was something I sensed, but I got cured. I didn't faint anymore. And when I was going to school, then my uncle, in fact, he realized, how can you go as a girl, go as a boy? So I had to again transform back into being a girl.
Did you like going back to becoming a girl? You also had to, you had a different name even as a boy.
Yeah, exactly. I had a name of a very powerful deity, death-defying deity, Jikje. So I don't know whether I liked it or not, but I always knew that I was a little different. that although I played their games, I followed the boys, I did whatever they did, I knew I was different. I mentioned that I was attracted to women's groups. I would go into the loom room where the women were weaving, and learn to weave and listen to their talks and their gossips and their stories. And although I was not treated differently, I knew I was not really 100% them. But when I went to school, and then they not only changed my clothing, but they also said, you can't have such a name. It's a deity's name. It's a male name. You can't have that. So I had to get back to being Kunzang Choden, which was my birth name. And it took me a while to, answering to Kunzang Choden, because I had, for the last 6-7 years, learned to be Jikje.
You mentioned that at that time you set out into this journey into the unknown. There are no phones. You can't reach the people you've left behind. You can't reach the people you're going to. And I mean, that isolation is so huge that even when you are at school in India, you don't know what's going on at home in Bhutan. And you didn't even know that your parents had died. How did you find out?
The more than the journey and being thrust into a new world, new culture and everything, that really traumatized not only my life, but my brothers also. I think what had happened was that when my father died, people were so involved with doing all the rituals, we have long drawn rituals and all sort of things, that they were so engaged in that with my mother also. And they didn't think it was important to let the children know. I mean, what would the children do? We couldn't come back to be with the family. And coming back was, such a long journey and so complicated to go to the schools and ask and things like this. We would have spent at least 2 months going back and forth and performing the rituals and things like this. And I think that was the biggest trauma I suffered. And 2 years later, my mother died, which was again something that was so big and so traumatic that we couldn't even talk about. We didn't even say the word death. When somebody dies, there's a special term you say, either died or passed on or gone. We could never bring ourselves to say that for a long time, because for us, we never witnessed their deaths. We didn't participate in any of the rituals. So it was kind of a secret that we shared, a burden that we carried, a pain that we carried all our lives. And it was something that even today I feel that I mourn it. I miss that. And, in Bhutanese, traditional Buddhist, how we behave after death is we have so many gatherings, family comes together, friends come together, we feed the dead, we perform rituals. And I think that's very important. It's very expensive and long drawn, but I think it's very important because I think that's a healing process and we miss that.
So there's no sense of closure.
Exactly. That's the word.
In fact, I was astonished when you said, I think with your father's death, you as a little girl don't even know about it. Tell us about the story about how you found out from your brother.
My brother, who was just 1 year younger than me, he was there. He was at the death and he must have experienced in his own way how things happened. And during the winter of 1962, when I had my school holidays, he came with my mother to be with us in Kalimpong. And nobody told us about the death or anything like this. There were 2 cinema halls in Kalimpong those days, and we went to every movie that came into town, Hindi or English or whatever. So once we were watching Hindi movie, and my brother was sitting next to me in this darkened room. And of course, it was always packed. Those days, cinema halls were very noisy, very smelly. You could smell everything that people were eating. And there was a scene of a cremation in the movie on the screen. And he very matter of fact said, that's what they did to our father. And that really just threw me up. And I suddenly became conscious of the darkened room. And I was sitting on the seat, my feet were not even touching the ground because I was small and the seats were big. And then I suddenly felt the distance that I was no longer grounded, that I was in the dark and they were just silhouettes of the other people. And it was kind of a moment of, I don't know, there was a big realization that I was small, I was unimportant.
But the other issue, Kunzang Choden, is that you come, as you say, from this landed family. Your parents are part of this elite, but they die very young of an unknown disease. I mean, what kind of medical treatment was even available at that time in Bhutan that these young people will die and nobody knows what is actually wrong with them?
In those days, Sandip, we had no Western allopathic medical systems in place. So the only medical facilities we had were homeopathic. We used a lot of herbs. We collected our own herbs, powdered them. We, made them into paste. We made them into pills. That's how we were treated. And the other one was we prayed. We had a lot of remedies for headaches, remedies for body aches, remedies for, But with all that, in those days, records tell us that life expectancy at that time was 37. And my father died at 37. In our culture, we have difficult years, okay? Like for women, it's 25. So 37 is said to be the most dangerous year for men. So my father dying at 37, they said the obstacles were too strong and no remedy could be, resolve these obstacles. So he died having had the most complicated rituals done, the most complicated procedures based on our, traditional medicine done, like burnings and cuttings and pills and all these things. And then 2 years later, my mother died. She was not at a critical age, but I think she, as I said, I think she was such an unhappy person that, especially after her husband died, and the children were sent away, and I think she was brought as a bride to marry my father, a man she had never seen the pictures. It's like a arranged marriage, and she didn't know what she was coming into. And I think she never really felt completely accepted by the community somehow. And she had other aspirations. She wanted to study and, practice religion and things like this. So, yeah, she was very young. She was very young and she had no indications of illness. I don't know what she may have died of, but I feel maybe my father had diabetes because the symptoms now, we know the symptoms now. So he had a very, very acute thirst and dryness of the mouth and things like this, but there was no blood tests to confirm any of that. Now life expectancy has grown and it's now 70. So big, big leap forward.
When you look back now, especially at a time when your parents were still there, what are your happiest memories of childhood at your ancestral home?
I remember that our childhood was quite formal. My parents, they weren't overly affectionate or, endearing, holding us or carrying us in their lap, but being treated in a way where we had to learn what was the norm, how we were expected to behave. So we were being disciplined and watched and shaped for our roles as, children of the landed family. But there were moments like when I learned to ride a horse, already at a young age. My father let me ride with him and hold me. And these kind of things I just treasure. I still think of these as very, very special moments of, close connection and endearment. When people came to see us, from the village or from relatives from far, my mother would be standing next to me and turn her face away and say, now say this, say that, teaching us, training us. But then when I was with her alone, then she would let down all the guards and we could just be ourselves. And I remember very fondly when two of us in Samtsi, which is the south of Bhutan, it's subtropical and warm. And after father died, she had come to Kalimpong and then we came to this place and how two of us were taking a bath under a running tap. Such a luxury to have a tap. We didn't have to go and bring it in a pitcher, sitting, and we were like two little girls. And these are the memories that I really treasure And I, get that warm, fuzzy feeling when I ever think of these scenes.
I was really struck by the fact that your mother told you, and this is something you remember, I mean, you had such little time with her, that she did not wish to be reborn in a landed family. Why do you think that was?
She herself came from a landed family where there was a distinct, very visible hierarchy, and the people from landed families were, they had a lot of entitlements, a lot of privileges, and the people who worked for them, it was all right for them to do the work, to do all the, eat less, eat variety of foods, amounts of foods, wear different kind of clothes. And I think my mother saw all these as something unnatural, something that didn't go down with her at all. And after she came as a bride to father's family, she was expected to be the mistress who kind of measured the food, who gets what food to eat, who gets what to wear, how is to be treated, and, all these norms and the hierarchical demands. And she never felt comfortable. And I told you, she even went to the extent of exchanging her food for food from the common kitchen where, the food that was made for the workers, and whether she really liked the food the workers were eating or whether she did it as a quiet demonstration of the inequalities, I don't know. I think that was her quiet way of saying that it's not to be the enforcer of such inequalities.
When did you first become aware of this kind of social inequality? Because there is also a tendency, especially I will say when you come from landed families, and it's true in India as well, to sort of romanticize that inequality where you think like, oh, these people who worked in our fields love us so much. They come with gifts of rice and things,
I think it may have been the influence of my mother, because I already realized, and I was very uncomfortable in many situations, like when we traveled, even when we traveled just in the village to go on for a journey somewhere. I felt very uncomfortable riding, and then the people around us all walking and carrying loads. And that really used to make me feel very, very uncomfortable. But we had been taught to ride, and that's how it was. And it took me a long time that this was not correct. And then there was also times when father, he was the master and the law keeper, and then there were incidences of him scolding the workers, and that made me really uncomfortable. And there were instances when I actually couldn't stand it and had to run out and cry, because I loved my father, I respected him, but I just felt it pained me. And I think this may have come from my mother, because she was so aware of these things. And my father had to do it because that was his job, that was his duty, proper behavior. So I think I always felt very uncomfortable. Like I say that in the old system, we even didn't eat out of each other's cups and plates, because we observe very strong beliefs about juta. You don't mix mouths and things like this. And I had no qualms about going and eating out of somebody's plate, or, not carrying my own cups, so that, So I think these came, I don't know when, there wasn't one incident that made me realize, but I think it was something that I noticed.
Right. And what I think really also surprised me, I mean, the things we take for granted. For example, I am speaking to you from Kolkata, and rice is part of our meal. Some people eat rice 3 times a day here. But tell us about how rice differentiated the haves and the have-nots in a place like Bhutan where you were growing up.
Well, it's not all over Bhutan, Sandip. I'm talking about Pumthang, where I live, where my home is located, is 3,000. And then we had our paddy fields all around on the hillsides and the valley bottoms. And at that time, we couldn't grow rice because it's just too cold and high. So because it was such a rare food that it was considered to be the most coveted food. Okay. And the people in the region only ate what was grown locally. But we had what was grown locally, the buckwheat and the wheat, the barley, but we also had rice, but rice had to be brought from a region, which was also our land at that time. It was what we called our winter resort, and we had to travel for 3 days, cross over a very high mountain and carry every kilo of rice across this mountain for 3 days and bring it to a house and have it cooked. I was always reminded by my mother that, every grain of rice is a drop of sweat, and don't disrespect, eat everything, don't drop a single grain. The family ate rice at least 2 times a day, and the people who worked for us ate buckwheat and wheat. But now, of course, with younger people don't realize it because rice is now so readily available. Most of our rice comes from India. We grow rice. We grow rice in places where rice didn't grow because of global warming. There's areas where it was too cold to grow rice.
Right.
We can grow rice now. So rice is no longer the most coveted. Educated and people who are aware even know that rice is not the healthiest, that we are going back now to eating our buckwheat and wheat and maize and things like this. But in those days it was, and it really made a distinction. And we had different qualities of rice. These were given to the older servants. There were some who were given to the monks. And there was the one which was highly polished again by pounding it in a mortar with a pistol. Highly polished, and that the family ate. And for all the wrong reasons in those days.
Apart from rice, though, what were things that were part of your childhood, whether it was games or rituals, that are not anymore the part of the childhood of Bhutanese people growing up now?
I am an old woman, and I speak like an old woman. And as children growing up, we didn't know books. We didn't have radio. We didn't have any toys. If we wanted toys, we had to invent toys. If you wanted to hear a story, you had to beg a storyteller to tell you, or your grandmother, or your aunt, or your grandfather to tell you a story. So one thing that what is really different now, I observe with young children, is we never use the word bored. And today, every child, if they don't have the mobile or they don't have the iPad or they don't have something like that, they say, I'm bored. And I don't think we ever use that word bored, because we were always inventing things.
What kind of things were you inventing?
We were making toys ourselves with twigs and strings and things like this. And games, there were some established games that we played, like hide and seek in the forest was something amazing. Now the children don't know which car to hide behind or which. And lot of stories we would enact. So there was kind of a drama that I be the ghost and you are the hiding, your children that are being hidden and things like this. So we lived the stories. Like they were, one particular thing that we have is that a day when we are encouraged to eat, no? Because this is the day that your stomach has to be really full, because this is the day when the ghost come and weigh you. And if you're under a certain weight, they'll take you. So, eating till were quite silly. And eating was, limited food people could eat. But on that day, you were allowed to eat. And I can remember the years that we ate so much that we were just rolling around because we were so afraid that if we came under a certain weight, we'd be taken away.
What was your favorite thing to eat?
My favorite thing to eat as a child was with my girlfriends playing, and we had small pots and pans and cooking, and whatever we could cook ourselves, that was the best. And it could be just some leaves cooked in some oil and salt, and especially cooking out by ourselves on makeshift stoves. And cooking, it was quite raw and sometimes not enough salt. But it was because we had cooked it, we enjoyed it so much. Joy. I still think of that. And I still have a taste of those kind of foods, which I have not been able to make, because now I think I have all the ingredients. And those days it was sometimes just raw spinach or raw chili or something. But those were the best foods. And I think it's the way, the atmosphere or the ambience of how we had cooked it, and, singing and dancing, inventing our dances and singing and things like this. I think these were the the happiest times.
While I was reading the book, I was struck by the role religion plays in the ordinary day-to-day lives of your family and other people. And listening to you now, I am thinking whether religion, apart from its importance as a matter of faith, was also a source of entertainment for young children like you, a way that religious rituals prevented you from getting, as we say, bored.
Well, I think very much so. And my family considered themselves to be the religious nobility. So many of their duties and many of the things that they did were to keep the temples alive with rituals going on every day. And even the community, at least one male person from the village households was what we call a gomchen, which is a lay monk, which means that they don't have to go to a monastery or observe celibacy, but they can marry and do their farming. And times of when there was a requirement for rituals, they would just come. Even now, it happens like this. And this was our legacy. So we had so many different rituals. And at the time we have rituals, there's always food involved. So all of the best, the rarest fruits and candy for the first time, tasting candy and sugar. And all this was coming through these religious offerings. And it was not so strict that only certain people could go here and certain people could not go there. We could go into the ritual rooms, sit there, imitate the monks, learn what they were doing, seeing how they were making the offerings and things like this. And we didn't have religious classes where you had to learn to identify the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. Just by being there, we learned that this is Buddha, this is a Bodhisattva. And then all the murals in the temples, they were just full of stories. It was like reading a book, pictorial book, and identifying who was who and who comes at the time of death and who is the one you have to invoke and take blessings from when you're afraid. So we learned. It was where the temple was open. We were there all the time, playing if we are not observing a ritual or something like this. And our house was one that was privileged to have a big temple. So in those days, there was rituals. Even the village people would come and ask to have a ritual performed. Now, with the economic prosperity, most people have their own altars. So they have their small rituals in the house, and only when they want big rituals and have about 20 monks or so, they come to our house. So somehow, one of the duties was not only Father being the Lord of the region, but he also had to make sure that religion was alive and accessible to all. Yeah.
In fact, your father's brother leaves home to become a lama in Tibet, and then he comes back to be sort of your guardian after your parents died and sort of take over the estate. It must have been difficult for him too, because this is exactly what he had been chosen to leave.
Exactly. He became our only parent when both my parents died, and he became a lot of things combined in one. So he was the religious hierarch there, he was the lord of the region, and he was a parent. All the things that he had run away from, actually. His whole motive to go to Tibet was to go to a religious center and practice and learn. And then with him, of course, the first thing that brought him back was the invasion of Tibet. In 1959, he came away, and his intention was to follow his masters into Tibet or into exile, wherever they were his masters, because he felt his education had not been completed. Then with my father dying, he came back. He was performing all the rituals for, building stupas and, memorials for my father. And then 2 years later, my mother died. Then he was stuck. And he considered it one of his biggest misfortunes. But he just felt that this was an obstacle, karmic obstacle, that he couldn't get away from it.
You were very young then, so I don't know whether you were just relieved that your uncle was there, or did you feel somewhat guilty that in a way having to look after you and your brothers was preventing him from doing what he wanted to do?
With the hindsight, I do. But in those days, as it actually happened, we were very glad to have him. He was the anchor. It kept us connected to the house. And although he had no practice of running a household and doing all the things that needed to be done to keep up this estate, he didn't have problems with the religious practices. He could keep up the rituals and the thing. But all the things about land and property and all the disputes and all the bureaucracy that came in, thinking back now, I think it was a very testing time for him. And he died also quite young. He was not yet 60 when he died.
Right. I want to get into some of those changes, but one of the things that you mentioned was he had gone to Tibet to study and the invasion by China forced him back. What are your memories of the refugees from Tibet coming into Bhutan at that time?
Yeah, we always knew Tibet. I mean, we always looked to Tibet as our religious center, and it was the dream destination for every Buddhist pilgrim to be able to go to Tibet. But not many people went because although we're just about where I am, where my home is, to Lhasa, it would be about 8 to 9 days travel across high mountains, but that was all relative. And we knew people who went, like my parents went, my mother went, and people who could afford it and could arrange for everything, they could go to these places. And then suddenly, we, from hearing about Tibet and the grandeur and the wealth and the temples and the monks and everything, suddenly we had all these refugees coming into the country. And if you look at my place, Pumtang, which is central Bhutan, is just south of central Tibet. Okay. So there was one or two traders who'd come during our time, carrying the wares, like gypsies, like hawkers. They would come and sell things. And that was our image, the monks, the religious stories and tales that pilgrims told us. And suddenly we had all these people, families coming in, trickling in, and begging. They would be parents and the children hanging on, hungry children coming, and they would be begging everywhere. And every day, I think it must have been 1950s, 60s, because I remember late 1959, after 59 it was, and 60s, every day there were new families coming in. And they were desperate. They had nothing except the clothes on their back. And then they were trying to sell off their, little jewelry or something that they had get against a meal. And this was quite horrendous. And we also learned already at that age that what was driving them away was communism. And of course, we didn't know what it was, but we knew it was something really bad, to the point that we even turned our games into how we could, like my brother's shooting a mouse, poor little mouse, they were shooting him and saying, that's Mao Zedong. So it was coming into our life like this. And then there were stories about how if you acquired a certain thing from a bird's nest, you could become invisible. Then why did you want to become invisible? Become invisible to go and assassinate Mao Zedong. That's horrible. I won't get my visa to go to saying this. And in my village alone, there was a camp. It's called the Tibetan camp. And the refugees were staying there. And they would tell us terrible stories of how they escaped, how many had started the journey and how many have managed to reach. And I had my own relatives from Tibet who were also quite a privileged family, and they escaped, but they went back to get their, treasures, and then they were caught. And then my parents were always asking, how is our relative? And finally we heard that they had been taken, imprisoned, and they were going through this self-denunciation. And just recently I was talking to some old women, and they were saying we were so poor ourselves that we couldn't give them, the refugees, anything. If we had only had the resources we have now, we could have shared so much. So that means each person of my age or older generation, somebody young, still carry the pain of that experience.
That's really striking because it sort of goes to what I wanted to ask you when you were saying about how your uncle struggled to hold on to and manage the properties as Bhutan is changing and you have to pay taxes and things. and the story about people who had nothing then, they're better off now. So there is this modernization happening, and there's so change happening. At the same time, Bhutan is always has been seen as trying to strike a balance about preserving something that is essentially Bhutanese, as well as trying to modernize at the same time, which is a balancing act. How did that affect families like yours? Because, as you say, your uncle struggled to keep it all together.
He struggled quite a lot, especially because he had to work as a feudal lord when he was actually a religious practitioner. So that was really a big dilemma for him. And I also, with the hindsight, I said, as children, we sort of just walked with the changes. We went along with the changes, and it wasn't really troublesome for us. I mean, if you think about it now, we think maybe it was quite a big journey that changed everything. But I always say, in a way, maybe my parents, having died at the age that they died, they didn't have to go through the same struggle as my uncle, because I watched the pain that he went through. And I say maybe my parents were spared from that pain and the trauma because they were grounded, and they thought they had, we believe in rebirth, that your accumulated karma brings you into this birth. And so, I'm sure they thought that they had deserved to be where they were, but then to change that and say maybe not, whereas children are just going forward. For them, it would have been a full stop, complete turnaround, and understand what was happening, or try to understand, comprehend what was. And that would have been difficult. And there were quite a lot of households like us in Bhutan, and many of them have gone under. Their houses are not being kept. Their land has been taken away. So we are one of the few foolish people who have held on and created the museum and tried to relive it and breathe new life into it.
I mean, every time something like whatever, cable TV comes to Bhutan, there's lots of stories and people do, wow, cable TV has come to Bhutan. But looking back now, what do you think is the most significant way that Bhutan has changed in the last decades?
In the last decade or so, I'd say, I think the biggest change was the open, accessible education, modern education. I think education was the biggest change, making schools were accessible to all. Anyone could go to school. And that was the biggest turning around in Bhutan. And for women, I think modern health facilities being open and accessible to all was a big change. And for women, I think it was maternal health and children's health. I think these, for me, was the biggest turning points. I mean, having my aunt die at 28 because she bled to death after giving birth to twins. And deaths was so common. Every time there was a cough and cold or some kind of a infectious disease, the whole village would be mourning their deaths. And I think the health facilities and education was the biggest thing. Of course, the roads that brought in all these changes. And at the time when I went to school in India, the first roads were being measured. Alignments were being made. So within my lifetime, having never seen a car or car road, now we even go to the next door grocery to buy, in a car. You don't walk.
You don't go on an yak? I was hoping I could go to visit.
As children, we did. But now yaks are becoming a big rarity, because I always make a joke saying that our yak populations are decreasing, and yet yak herders don't want to stay there because it's not within the reach of the mobile phones. Because even yak herders have phones now.
Do you get tired sometimes whenever people bring up the very popular image of Bhutan being the happiest country in the world? I mean, what is the biggest challenge of living in a country called the happiest country in the world?
You're the only one who's really asking me if I get tired, which is very different to what people come and say, how does it feel to be the happiest country? Yeah, I do get tired of people coming. And I think this is really because of tourism and people who are looking just for pleasure travel, who are looking for the happiest country. They've been to all sorts of countries. And now at the last country, the happiest country. And I think the misconception somehow has been to our advantage because it brings people to come. but to our disadvantage because they think, oh, there's nothing more for Bhutan. Everybody's so happy there, which is not true. I mean, happiness is such a relative term. And the concept was born from the fact that we said we want to look for the welfare of the people rather than the material wealth. But now we find you still need your economic prosperity to be happy. You need your material goods to be happy. So it's a paradox we're living in a way. And having to defend myself against this question, are you the happiest person? Every day I have to think of something to say.
Well, I mean, you've had a very fascinating life, Kunzang Choden. You know, you are the first Bhutanese woman to be published in English. You started collecting vanishing folk tales. You ended up marrying somebody who was not Bhutanese. You could have had a very different life somewhere else. You studied in the US and all of that. I wonder why you came back to your ancestral home, Ogyen Choling, to sort of revive it and live in it. Because in some ways, your childhood there with your parents was so truncated and so short.
Now I go back to be a real Bhutanese person. It's my karmic debt. It's true. I could have had opportunities to stay there wherever I was. I had opportunities. Maybe I could have lived in my husband's country. I would have had opportunities to do some other things. Even in Bhutan, I could be somewhere else, far away from Ogyen Choling. But it's some kind of a inexplicable reason that I feel that it is my life's destiny, that I have to be there. I have to look up. And the irony is, all the 20 generations before me, it was always the males. It was a male-headed household. It was a patriarchy. And I am just a foolish woman who is there trying to revive the memory and the history and everything. And I can't explain it. I just feel it's like my duty. This is what my life's, what was meant to be. In doing it is to first, you have to fit into the system that exists. It could have been just a temple and we would have gone on. But I just also wanted not to let this physical house go into ruin. And I said, as long as I'm alive, I want to do it. And it cost a lot of emotions. Of course, resources we didn't really worry about because we said we will do it as we are able to and not run around for funds and not go for donations and things like this. Then slowly we realized that it's not only I'm doing it for myself, but I'm also doing it for the future generations. Because many people who come to the museum, to the temples, they cannot believe that there was a time like this in Bhutan. That was not so long ago in my lifetime when a household like this existed, what each room was, what it meant to be, how people were to be expected to behave, what are the artifacts. And now we have people coming, Bhutanese people coming and saying, gosh, this is how it was 50 years ago, 60 years ago. So it's become a center, an institute for learning also and recalling. And now that's a greater purpose than just my emotional being there, my parents' home, my ancestors' home. I'm there every day, walking around the museum, trying to, keep. And I think it's good also because when you say now I'm retired at 65 or 70, we stop. No, we just keep on going. And then I think we'll just drop when our physical body is completely exhausted.
Well, Kunzang Choden, I hope someday I get to go and meet you there and talk to you under the oak trees of your ancestral home. But
please. I look forward to that day.
Thank you so much. And Kunzang Choden, thank you for telling me your stories today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandip, for having me.
Kunzang Choden is the author of the critically acclaimed book, The Circle of Karma, and the novella Dawa. Her latest book is the memoir, Telling Me My Stories, Fragments of a Himalayan Childhood. Find us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram at Express Podcasts. This show was produced by Shashank Bhargava and edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. Thanks for listening. This is Sandip Roy on Express Audio.